September 4th, 1944. For a brief, exhilarating moment, it seems the war in Western Europe might be ending. British troops roll into Antwerp almost unopposed, greeted by crowds waving flags and tossing flowers. The vast port, one of the largest in Europe, is captured intact, its docks and cranes untouched. To commanders on the ground, it looks like a miracle. A deep-water harbour this close to the front could shorten Allied supply lines by hundreds of miles. But there's a catch, a silent, strategic trap. Though Antwerp itself is free, the river that connects it to the sea is not. The western Scheldt estuary, a winding tidal artery stretching almost 100 kilometres to the North Sea, remains firmly in German hands. Without control of that waterway, no ship can reach the port. Antwerp, for all its cranes and quays, is a harbour locked behind enemy lines. In early September, few realise the scale of the problem. The Allied advance out of Normandy continues to surge, divisions racing through Belgium toward the German frontier. Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushes for bold strokes. Arnhem, the Rhine, the endgame. Antwerp seems secure, the Germans in retreat. But as maps are studied more closely, a grim realisation sets in. The German 15th Army, battered but not broken, has withdrawn north and west, digging into the lowlands of Zeeland and along the estuary's southern shore. They control the very gates to the harbour. The geography itself favours defence. The Scheldt snakes through mudflats and polders, past dikes and flooded fields. On the south bank lies the Breskens pocket, fortified German positions covering the approaches from the landward side. To the north stand South Beveland and, beyond it, Walcheren Island, an island fortress bristling with coastal guns, dominating the estuary's mouth. Together, these positions form a deadly funnel. Any ship attempting to enter Antwerp would pass within range of German artillery almost the entire way. At first, Allied planners underestimate how tightly the estuary is held. The capture of Antwerp seems too good to pause over. Supplies still arrive through Normandy and the smaller Channel ports. Optimists argue that the Germans will crumble before the logistics become critical. Yet as September wears on, the front lines stretch ever farther from their supply bases. Fuel and ammunition shortages begin to bite. The miracle port remains silent, its docks empty. Inside the ruined harbour, engineers inspect the vast basins and warehouses, counting what could be unloaded, if only the sea lanes were open. The potential is staggering, a port capable of handling 40,000 tons of cargo per day, enough to feed and arm entire armies. But every ton still has to come by truck from the beaches of Normandy, a journey of hundreds of miles across war-torn France, consuming almost as much fuel as it delivers. The men driving those convoys call it the Red Ball Express. It's heroic but unsustainable. Meanwhile, the Germans are anything but finished. On Walcheren, they built gun batteries into concrete bunkers, covering the channel with overlapping fire. On the flooded plains south of the estuary, they dig trenches, lay mines, and turn villages into strongpoints. The 15th Army, commanded by Gustav Adolf von Zangen, knows that every day they hold the Scheldt buys Germany time to regroup behind the Rhine. For them, the estuary is not just a defensive line. It is a delaying wall protecting the heartland. Within the Allied High Command, frustration grows. Field Marshal Montgomery sees the problem, but his focus is split. Operation Market Garden, the airborne thrust toward the Rhine, takes precedence. Clearing the Scheldt seems secondary, a task for later. To the Canadian First Army, led by General Harry Crerar, falls the unenviable duty of later by mid-September. It is clear that without their effort, Antwerp will remain a prize that cannot be used. On paper, the situation appears solvable, a series of coastal operations of limited scope. In reality, it will become one of the most difficult and overlooked campaigns of the Western Front. The terrain is unforgiving. Soft earth, dikes that can be flooded or broken at will, and a network of waterways that turn every advance into an amphibious assault. Rain and tides dictate movement as much as any general's plan. In the liberated city itself, the mood shifts. The cheering crowds of early September fade as the weeks pass and the docks remain idle. Civilians rebuild their streets while Allied convoys rumble past, heading east instead of north. Few in Antwerp yet realise that their port, captured with so little blood, will soon become the centre of one of the hardest fought battles of the autumn. By the end of the month, the situation can no longer be ignored. Market Garden has failed to seize a bridge over the Rhine. Supplies are dwindling. The front has stalled. Commanders begin to understand that no matter how far the armies advance, they cannot outpace their own logistics. The answer lies not in pushing deeper into Germany, but in turning back toward the cold, flooded lowlands of the Scheldt. The city of Antwerp, liberated but useless, waits like a promise unfulfilled. A key without a lock. To open it, the Allies must clear the estuary, storm the islands, and wrest control of every gun along the waterway. It will require amphibious craft, minesweepers, engineers, and thousands of infantrymen slogging through mud and tidal flats under relentless fire. The Battle of the Scheldt is about to begin, a battle not for conquest but for access, a campaign to turn a silent port into the beating heart of the Allied advance. And as the rains of autumn fall across the flooded polders, the 1st Canadian Army prepares to move. The harbour stands ready, the gateway is still closed. The next move, clearing the Scheldt, will decide whether Antwerp becomes the Allies' salvation or remains their most significant missed opportunity. By late September 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe was beginning to slow. The summer's headlong rush from Normandy had carried divisions deep into Belgium, even to the borders of Germany, but it had stretched the supply lines to breaking point. Fuel trucks ran dry along French roads, maintenance crews scavenged for spare parts, and rations arrived late or not at all. Commanders knew the truth. Victory was not just about battles, it was about logistics. Antwerp, on every map, was the solution. Its harbour could unload the vast tonnage needed to sustain entire armies, and its location, close to the front, promised to transform the Allied war machine. But as the days passed, the port's silence became ominous. Warehouses stood empty, cranes motionless. Supplies still came through the Normandy beaches and a handful of small channel ports, hundreds of miles behind the front. The result was a logistical chokehold, an army that had raced forward faster than its supplies could follow. The problem had been foreseen by planners, but underestimated in urgency. The so-called Red Ball Express, a non-stop trucking route from Normandy, became a lifeline. Thousands of drivers, many from segregated American units, ran convoys day and night, moving fuel, ammunition, and food across battered French roads. But the further the Allied spearheads pushed, the more those same trucks consumed their own cargo in fuel. The balance was unsustainable. In this growing crisis, the captured port of Antwerp appeared to be a godsend held hostage. From a distance, it was already won. In practice, it was useless. Every shell, every gallon of petrol reaching the front still had to travel the long overland route. Field depots emptied faster than they could be replenished. Armoured columns halted, not for lack of courage, but for lack of diesel. At the heart of the debate stood a question of priorities. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, pressed forward with Operation Market Garden, the daring attempt to seize a bridgehead over the Rhine. To him, the Scheldt could wait, but among staff officers, doubts grew louder. The Canadian commander, General Harry Crerar, and his subordinates understood that Antwerp would remain a hollow prize until its approaches were cleared. Reports from the front warned that the German 15th Army was entrenching in the estuary, using the reprieve to build formidable defences. For the soldiers waiting to move, the tension was palpable. They had fought their way through France, expecting rest. Instead, they faced a new campaign through flooded lowlands and fortified dikes. Yet the order had not come. In late September, Crerar's forces remained stretched between maintaining pressure along the front and guarding long flanks. The longer the delay, the stronger the Germans became. The logistical crisis began to affect the strategy itself. With Market Garden faltering and Allied spearheads stalling for fuel, the illusion of unstoppable momentum faded. Analysts in Schaff the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force warned that unless Antwerp was opened before winter, the advance might grind to a halt. German counterattacks, supplied over shorter internal lines, could even reverse the gains of summer. Every ton mattered. At that stage, the Allies needed roughly 26,000 tons of supplies daily just to maintain operations in northwest Europe. Normandy's makeshift ports and the smaller Belgian harbours could handle only a fraction of that. Antwerp alone could change everything if only the Scheldt could be cleared. The situation forced a reckoning. Montgomery and Eisenhower clashed over focus and resources. The airlift at Arnhem had failed to secure a crossing over the Rhine. Now, the 21st Army Group had to turn its attention north and west toward the marshes and islands that still blocked the sea route. On September 12th, the task of clearing the Scheldt was officially assigned to the 1st Canadian Army. It was to be a job of engineering as much as fighting, dredging channels, draining polders, crossing canals and estuaries under fire. But before any assault could begin, the Canadians faced a logistical challenge of their own. Their units were scattered, their equipment worn from months of combat, and the terrain ahead demanded specialized amphibious craft, buffaloes, terrapins, landing barges, all in short supply. Men and guns did not just defend the estuary, it was defended by geography itself. Still, the alternative was untenable. The entire Allied front was feeding through an overextended supply chain that wound like a lifeline back to Normandy. Engineers nicknamed it the pipelines of patience. Depots ran empty, faster than they could be restocked. Tanks were abandoned when their fuel convoys couldn't keep up. The advance into Germany, the goal everyone believed was just weeks away, was now hostage to logistics. In October, as rain began to fall and the roads turned to mud, the pressure finally broke through the indecision. Orders came down. The 1st Canadian Army would clear the Scheldt. Every town, every dike, every gun position would have to be taken. There could be no shortcuts. For the men preparing to move north from the Belgian border, it was a sobering prospect. The maps showed little more than a tangle of waterways and polders. Locals warned of tides that could flood entire fields overnight. The Germans had already begun destroying bridges and opening dikes, turning the lowlands into a labyrinth of water. Yet behind the planning tables, one truth gave the effort urgency. If Antwerp stayed closed, the Allied offensive would run out of breath before reaching the Rhine. The grand ambitions of Market Garden, of a quick thrust into Germany, were already fading. Only by opening the Scheldt and the port could the offensive be sustained. By early October, Canadian and British divisions began to concentrate along the southern approaches. Intelligence reported the Germans holding firm on the north bank of the Leopold Canal, their positions bristling with guns and mines. Engineers prepared assault boats. Reconnaissance patrols measured tides and currents. The battle that would follow was not glamorous. There would be no sweeping breakthroughs or parades, only the slow grind of men and machines through water and mud. But the stakes were higher than any single battle line. In the flooded flatlands ahead lay the key to victory's momentum. Each gallon of fuel, each shell, each ration reaching the front depended on opening the Scheldt. The Allies had captured the port, but the sea was still closed. Now, the 1st Canadian Army was preparing to enter the estuary, where the land itself could drown them before the enemy even fired a shot. The first phase of the battle began in early October 1944. The orders were clear. The 1st Canadian Army was to drive north, clear the southern bank of the Scheldt, and force the Germans out of their strongholds along the estuary. But the terrain awaiting them was like nothing they had faced before. The land between the Belgian border and the western Scheldt was low, flat, and already half underwater. Canals crisscrossed the polders. Dikes rose like walls above flooded fields. The Germans had taken advantage of every contour, flooding large areas deliberately and turning the rest into kill zones. The so-called Breskens pocket, a fortified area on the south shore of the estuary, bristled with machine guns, minefields and artillery. The men defending it were veterans of retreating battles, now ordered to hold to the last man. The Canadians moved northward from the Leopold Canal, What should have been a short advance became a grueling crawl through waterlogged ground. Mud sucked at boots and vehicles, tanks bogged down within minutes. Every attack meant crossing open polders with no cover, only sodden earth, and the occasional farmhouse turned into a German pillbox. The front line was defined less by trenches than by the reach of the tide. On October 6th, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division began probing attacks across the Leopold Canal. The canal itself was narrow, scarcely 30 metres wide, but steep-banked, and the opposite side was lined with barbed wire and machine gun nests. Early attempts to bridge it failed under withering fire. Engineers brought up storm boats, and men paddled across in darkness, carrying ropes and assault ladders, slipping in mud and water up to their waists. When dawn broke, the survivors clung to a thin strip of land, fighting for every metre. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly. Artillery fire echoed over the flooded fields, and snipers on higher ground harried the crossing points. Casualties were heavy, and for days the battle devolved into a grim contest of attrition. Every gain had to be held against counterblows launched from concealed dike positions. It was, one officer wrote, fighting not on land, but in a swamp that breathes death. As the Canadians advanced, they uncovered the sheer scale of the German fortifications. Concrete bunkers were dug into the sides of dikes, hidden gun ports commanded every approach. Whole sectors were mined or wired, and any attempt to move vehicles required hours of clearance. In some sectors, engineers resorted to using amphibious craft, the ungainly Buffalo and Terrapin, to ferry men and supplies across flooded areas. These vehicles would soon become the lifeline of the campaign. To the east, British units pushed to link up and cut the Germans off from retreat routes into South Beveland. The fighting was slow, house to house and farm to farm. Villages like Hoofdplaat and Beervliet were reduced to rubble, contested over and over until nothing recognizable remained. The Germans fought stubbornly, not out of fanaticism alone, but because their orders were absolute. Hold the estuary until reinforcements could build new defences along the Rhine. For the Canadians, the enemy was only half the problem. The weather turned against them. Rain mixed with salt spray, fog blanketed the lowlands, and every shell crater filled instantly with water. Rations and ammunition had to be ferried forward on makeshift rafts or hauled by hand through waist-deep mud. In some sectors, soldiers fought for hours to advance 50 yards. And yet, despite the misery, the offensive pressed on. By mid-October, the Breskens pocket was shrinking, but at terrible cost. Units were exhausted. Entire companies were reduced to a few dozen men. Reports described positions gained and lost within the same day, the tide itself dictating when attacks could be launched. The Germans began to fall back toward the coastal dunes near Breskens, where their artillery could still cover the estuary's southern shore. The Canadian advance had achieved its first objective, securing a foothold north of the Leopold Canal. But the main battle was still ahead. To the north, across the water, the outlines of South Beveland and Walcheren Island loomed, the remaining keys to the estuary. Between them and the Canadians lay miles of flooded terrain and narrow causeways that a handful of men could defend. Any attack there would require coordination between land, sea, and air, a combined operation as complex as any since Normandy. In Antwerp, Allied headquarters watched the reports with growing impatience. Each delay meant more time without using the port. Supplies continued to bottleneck in France, forcing commanders to ration fuel and ammunition. What began as a tactical campaign had become a strategic necessity. Every step forward in the mud of Zeeland brought the Allies closer to reopening the sea lanes, and yet the hardest work still lay ahead. By the third week of October, the southern shore of the Scheldt was largely in Allied hands. The Breskens pocket was collapsing, but the guns on the northern islands still commanded the channel, and as long as they stood, no ship could pass. The estuary remained closed, guarded by the German batteries on South Beveland and the fortress of Walcheren beyond. The Canadians had fought their way to the water's edge, but the sea was still the enemy. Ahead waited a new phase. Crossing to the islands, storming dikes and flooded causeways and bringing amphibious warfare to the lowlands. The next assault would decide whether Antwerp could finally breathe, or whether the estuary would remain, for another bitter month, a dead end of mud and blood. By late October 1944, the southern shore of the Scheldt was nearly secure, but the estuary itself remained blocked. The Germans still held two formidable positions: the South Beveland Peninsula, and beyond it, Walcheren Island, a fortress at the mouth of the river. Together, they formed the final barrier between Antwerp's docks and the open sea. To clear them, the Allies launched a pair of overlapping operations. The first was Operation Switchback, aimed at crushing the last German resistance in the Breskens pocket on the south shore. The second, Operation Vitality, would strike into South Beveland. Both would unfold under ceaseless rain, on terrain that seemed to dissolve beneath the soldiers' boots. Operation Switchback began on October 21st. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division moved to close the trap on the German 64th Division, still clinging to the dunes and canals south of the Scheldt. The enemy's positions were formidable: minefields, flooded ground, and an intricate network of pillboxes covering every approach. The only way through was the Leopold Canal, narrow, steep-banked and lined with wire. The assault started before dawn. Under a barrage of artillery, Canadian troops crossed in storm boats and amphibious craft, some paddling through mud and water waist-deep. They clawed a bridgehead onto the far bank, fighting to expand it against counterattacks launched from higher ground. Engineers struggled to throw bridges across under fire, often rebuilding them after each shelling. Progress was measured in yards, but the pressure held. Gradually, German resistance began to crumble. At the same time, amphibious landings were carried out along the coast of the Breskens pocket. Landing craft, manned by British and Canadian crews, ferried troops across tidal flats at low water, then raced back before the sea returned. It was a grim rhythm: advance, dig in, withdraw, attack again. The Germans fought stubbornly from concrete bunkers overlooking the dikes, but by the end of the month the pocket was collapsing. On November 3rd, the last defenders in Breskens surrendered. The south shore was finally clear. Now, attention turned north. Operation Vitality was already underway, aimed at taking the South Beveland Peninsula, a narrow strip of land that jutted into the estuary, linking the mainland to Walcheren Island by a single causeway. The Germans had turned that peninsula into a natural fortress, blowing dikes to flood the fields and mining every road. The only routes forward were narrow embankments under constant artillery observation. Canadian and British forces advanced along two axes. One column moved eastward along the Beveland Canal, another landed amphibiously to outflank the defences. The fighting was close and brutal. In the flooded fields, every farmhouse became a redoubt. Infantry waded through knee-deep mud under sniper fire. Tanks followed precariously on dikes only a few metres wide. When roads broke under the weight, supply trucks sank and had to be abandoned. Still, the Allied advance pressed on. By the end of October, the Canadians reached the eastern end of the peninsula and seized the canal crossings at Goes and Kreuningen. Resistance was fierce, but the Germans were now fighting isolated battles. The estuary's defences were being dismantled piece by piece. Throughout the campaign, the struggle for South Beveland underscored the peculiar nature of the Scheldt. This was not a war of sweeping manoeuvres, but of engineering and endurance. Flooded terrain turned every movement into an amphibious operation. Every mile gained required coordination among infantry, armour, and naval support rarely seen outside major landings. The estuary's geography made the campaign as much about water as about enemy fire. For the Allied soldiers, it was a test of sheer perseverance. Days blurred together in the cold and rain, weapons jammed from mud, boots rotted on men's feet, and yet progress was finally visible. Behind them, Antwerp's silent cranes awaited life. Ahead lay Walcheren, the island fortress at the mouth of the Scheldt. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Walcheren's shores were ringed with heavy coastal guns, some in concrete emplacements built to withstand direct hits. Its dikes and dunes offered little cover. To attack it head-on would mean crossing open water under fire. But there was one advantage the Allies could exploit: the sea itself. In late October, Royal Air Force bombers began striking Walcheren's dikes at Westkapelle and Vlissingen. The plan was audacious: to deliberately flood the island, isolating the German batteries and forcing them onto small pockets of high ground. It was a harsh tactic, one that would devastate civilian homes, but the alternative was a prolonged siege that would cost thousands more lives. When the bombs fell, the dikes broke and seawater poured in. Within days, most of the island lay submerged. For the defenders, the flooding turned their fortifications into islands. For the attackers, it meant that any assault would now require amphibious craft. The stage was set for Operation Infatuate, an amphibious landing through water and ruin to seize the final key to Antwerp's freedom. On the night of October 31st, as rain lashed the lowlands and tides swelled along the coast, assault craft began to gather at staging points. The battle for Walcheren, the last and hardest fight of the Scheldt campaign, was about to begin. The soldiers who had slogged through the mud of South Beveland now prepared to cross water once again, this time to an island fortress ringed with guns. Ahead lay the decisive assault that would determine whether Antwerp's port would finally open or remain trapped behind enemy lines. November 1st, 1944. The dawn came grey and heavy over the North Sea. Offshore, waves heaved against landing craft clustered in the mist. Inside them, men huddled among equipment and rifles slick with salt spray. Their destination was Walcheren Island, the final German bastion commanding the mouth of the Scheldt. If Antwerp was the heart of Allied logistics, Walcheren was the stone blocking its artery. To open the port, the island had to fall. Operation Infatuate had begun. The plan was as audacious as it was desperate. Walcheren's dikes had been bombed days earlier, flooding much of the island and forcing its garrison, nearly 10,000 German troops, to defend a scattering of higher ground and fortress positions. Still, the artillery on Walcheren remained deadly. Massive coastal guns at Domburg, Westkapelle and Flushing could reach any vessel attempting to use the Scheldt. The island was a fortress built of water and concrete. The assault came from two directions. From the sea, British commandos of the 4th Special Service Brigade prepared to storm the beaches near Westkapelle. From the east, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division advanced across the narrow causeway from South Beveland, a single road raised above flooded polders, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Both forces faced overlapping arcs of German fire, mines and treacherous tides. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Allied cruisers and destroyers shelled the coastline, their guns pounding the sea walls until entire sections collapsed. Landing craft moved in through the smoke, steering between floating debris and the half-submerged ruins of dikes. The commandos hit the beach first, clambering over rubble and twisted steel, while shells screamed overhead. The water, shallow but churning with mud, offered no cover. Many crafts were destroyed before they reached shore. Those who landed found themselves fighting not across fields, but across a drowned landscape. Rooftops just above the tide, barns half submerged, dikes turned into ridgelines. The Germans had fortified every remaining patch of dry land, and their heavy guns still fired from concrete bunkers that survived the bombing. Yet the commandos pressed inland, seizing Westkapelle and pushing toward Domburg. Amphibious buffalo vehicles ferried reinforcements through flooded terrain, their engines sputtering in salt water, while engineers blew gaps in dikes to create new channels of advance. On the eastern front, the Canadians faced the infamous Walcheren Causeway, barely 40 metres wide and more than a kilometre long. It stretched like a fragile ribbon between South Beveland and the island proper. The ground on either side was deep mud and open water, impassable. German machine guns and mortars covered the entire length. On October 31st and November 1st, Canadian infantry made repeated attempts to cross. Every advance was met with devastating fire. Men crawled forward along the embankment, using shell craters for cover. only to be caught in enfilade from bunkers at the far end. Casualties mounted quickly. The struggle for the causeway became one of the most brutal episodes of the campaign. Reinforcements from the Glasgow Highlanders joined the assault, fighting from crater to crater until they reached the island's side, only to be pushed back again. By November 2nd, the crossing was effectively sealed, but the diversion had served its purpose. While German defenders focused their attention on the causeway, the amphibious landings to the west were gaining ground. In Flushing, on the island's southern edge, British and Royal Marine units launched another amphibious assault, Infatuate II. They entered through flooded streets, using small craft to navigate canals and alleys under sniper fire. Civilians huddled in attics as the water rose around their homes. The destruction was immense, yet many of the island's residents aided the attackers, guiding them through submerged neighborhoods. Day by day, the defenders' positions collapsed. The flooding that was meant to protect them now isolated their units, cutting off communication and supplies. Allied troops advanced from three directions: east from the causeway, west from Westkapelle, and south from Flushing, compressing the German garrison into an ever smaller pocket. Resistance remained fierce. Coastal batteries at Domburg continued firing until overrun by direct assault, and some bunkers required flamethrowers and explosives to be silenced. By November 8th, it was over. The surviving German commander surrendered the island. The coastal guns fell silent for the first time in months. The estuary's mouth was open. For the Canadians, British and Dutch forces who had fought across the flooded lowlands, it was a hard-won victory. The cost had been high. Thousands of casualties, weeks of fighting in some of the worst terrain in Western Europe. Yet the goal, to free Antwerp's lifeline to the sea, was finally within reach. Standing on the ruined dikes of Walcheren, soldiers could see the vast grey expanse of the Scheldt stretching toward Antwerp. The path was open, but the work was not done. The waters were still mined, wrecks littered the channel, and navigation was perilous. Before the first convoy could sail, an army of minesweepers and engineers would have to clear 100 kilometres of treacherous waterways. Still, for the first time since September, hope returned. Antwerp's cranes would soon move again, and the Allied advance, stalled for want of supplies, could breathe. The Battle of the Scheldt had reached its climax on an island half under water, but victory at Walcheren was not the end, only the key turning in a long-locked gate. The next task would be to open it fully, to sweep the channel and to bring the first ships safely through the estuary's mined waters. The guns of Walcheren had fallen silent, but the sea itself was still deadly. The Scheldt estuary, nearly 100 kilometres of shifting currents and narrow channels, was laced with mines, wrecks, and scuttled vessels. Every obstacle had to be cleared before Antwerp could finally open to Allied shipping. The task would now fall to a different kind of fighting force: sailors, engineers, and minesweepers who would wage their own quiet war across the grey tidal water. Through mid-November 1944, Royal Navy flotillas began their work. Minesweeping was slow, perilous, and unrelenting. German forces had laid extensive minefields along the Scheldt and its approaches, designed to block any passage toward Antwerp. Some mines were magnetic, others acoustic, triggered by the hum of an engine. The tide shifted unpredictably. A single mistake could cost an entire crew. Each day, the minesweepers inched forward. Small motor launches and trawlers, refitted for the purpose, combed the waterway under constant threat. They towed steel cables across the currents, cutting loose the mines that bobbed to the surface, black spheres rolling in the waves, deadly as ever. Once sighted, gunners destroyed them with rifle fire or small cannon. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards cleared and channels marked. On shore, engineers and naval repair teams worked to remove wrecks and rebuild navigation lights. The port of Antwerp itself, untouched in structure but battered by months of neglect, had to be inspected pier by pier. Dredgers cleared silt from basins while cranes and gantries were tested and powered again for the first time since September. Meanwhile, along the coastline, German artillery still harassed the estuary. Small batteries and remnants of the 15th Army launched sporadic shell fire or sent floating mines downstream. Each sweep demanded another patrol. The men called it the invisible battle, where the enemy could not be seen but was always waiting just beneath the surface. By late November, reports from naval headquarters suggested the main channel was finally clear. On the 26th, a small flotilla of light coasters, shallow draft cargo vessels, made the cautious run upriver. It was a test convoy, moving under escort and constant vigilance. They reached Antwerp safely, greeted by a small crowd of dock workers and soldiers. It was the first proof that the river was open again. 2 days later, on November 28th, the moment the entire campaign had been fought for finally arrived. A Canadian-built merchant ship, the Fort Cataraqui, became the first Allied freighter to enter Antwerp's port. Its passage up the Scheldt was slow and ceremonial. Every gun position along the route now stood silent. As it passed the docks, cranes swung out once more, and crews cheered from the quays. The reopening of Antwerp was more than a symbolic victory. It was a logistical revolution. Until that day, every Allied advance into northwest Europe had been constrained by a single problem: distance. Supplies had to travel from the Normandy beaches or across small channel ports like Cherbourg and Boulogne, along roads that were already crumbling under the strain. Now, for the first time since D-Day, there was a deep-water port close to the front, capable of unloading thousands of tons a day. The impact was immediate. In the weeks that followed, long convoys of cargo ships began to make the journey up the estuary. They carried fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements, the lifeblood of the campaign. Antwerp quickly became the busiest port on the continent, processing tonnages that dwarfed anything the Allies had managed before. The long, grinding work through the mud and floods of the Scheldt was finally paying off. Yet even in success, the cost lingered. Minesweepers continued to lose ships to hidden charges well into December. Crews worked through freezing rain and snow, aware that one misstep could undo weeks of progress. On land, the men who had fought through South Beverland and Walcheren were withdrawn, exhausted. Many had not expected to survive the flooded polders. Now they watched the first ships sail, knowing that every metre of that waterway had been earned in blood and salt. For the Allied command, Antwerp's opening could not have come sooner. Winter was setting in, and the front lines had stalled. Armoured divisions stood idle, waiting for fuel. The supply crisis that had strangled the advance was easing at last, but even as the first convoys unloaded, ominous reports were arriving from the Ardennes, signs that the German army was preparing one last counterstroke. Still, for that brief moment in late November, the mood was one of relief and triumph. The estuary was open. The great port that had lain silent since September was alive again, its cranes swinging over the water, its quays stacked with crates, barrels, and tanks. The logistical artery of the Allied war effort had been restored. The Battle of the Scheldt, fought in water, mud, and ruin, had accomplished what strategy alone could not. It had reopened the gateway to victory, but its true legacy would unfold in the months ahead, when the supplies pouring through Antwerp would feed the next and final phase of the war. The ships were in, the port was alive. Now, the question remained: what would the Allies do with the momentum they had fought so hard to regain? With the port of Antwerp finally open, the Allies could at last exhale. For nearly 3 months, the Scheldt had been a bottleneck that threatened the entire Western campaign. Now, as December 1944 approached, the convoys steamed steadily upriver, the hum of engines echoing between flooded dikes that had only weeks earlier been battlefields. Between late November 1944 and April 1945, more than 2.5 million tons of supplies would pass through Antwerp. Ammunition, food, vehicles, and fuel poured into the port, unloaded by cranes that clattered day and night. The tonnage that had once taken weeks to move from Normandy could now arrive at the front in a matter of days. For Allied armies poised along the Rhine, Antwerp became their beating logistical heart, but the victory had come at a staggering cost. The Battle of the Scheldt had lasted over 8 weeks and left deep scars across Zeeland and northern Belgium. The 1st Canadian Army alone suffered roughly 12,800 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The waterlogged terrain had claimed almost as many through exhaustion and disease. For a campaign fought far from the headlines, it ranked among the most punishing in northwestern Europe. For the local population, the price was even more visible. Large parts of Zeeland lie underwater. Entire villages on Walcheren Island had been deliberately flooded to break German defences. Fields that had fed generations were now drowned in salt water. In the months after liberation, Dutch families began the slow task of draining the land, salvaging homes, and burying the dead. To them, the Scheldt was not just a battlefield, but a wound carved into their homeland. Yet despite the devastation, the achievement was immense. Military historians would later call it one of the most technically complex operations of the Western Front, an amphibious land and air campaign fought under some of the worst conditions imaginable. It combined the patience of engineers, the endurance of infantry, and the precision of naval coordination. Few operations so clearly demonstrated that logistics could win or lose wars. The timing proved crucial. Barely 3 weeks after the first ships entered Antwerp, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It was Antwerp, the very prize won through so much hardship, that became the ultimate German objective. The port was now so vital that its loss could have crippled the Allied advance entirely. But the supplies flowing through it allowed the Allies to recover quickly, contain the German offensive, and resume the push into the Rhineland by early 1945. The men who fought at the Scheldt often described it as a campaign of mud, water, and endurance, one where heroism looked less like glory and more like persistence. For the Canadians especially, it became a defining moment of their war. They had fought not for a capital or a front line, but for a harbour. A fight that demanded as much courage as any assault on a city or fortress. Many who survived the Scheldt would go on to cross into Germany months later, carrying with them memories of flooded fields, relentless rain, and comrades left behind on the dikes. When the port reached full operation in early 1945, Allied quartermasters noted something remarkable. Every ton of cargo arriving in Antwerp shortened the war. It meant fuel for Patton's tanks, rations for Eisenhower's armies, ammunition for the Rhine crossings. What had begun as a local, almost secondary campaign had become the keystone of the entire Allied advance. In the Netherlands, liberation had come at a terrible cost. The flooded farmlands would take years to reclaim, and the scars of the battle remained visible long after the war ended. But many Dutch civilians remembered the Canadians not just as soldiers, but as the ones who freed their coasts from occupation, and who, in doing so, opened the sea again to trade, relief, and life. In Allied headquarters, Antwerp became a case study in the cost of underestimating logistics. Capturing a port, commanders realized, meant little if the route to it remained in enemy hands. The lesson was written in the mud of Zeeland. Strategy must flow as surely as the supplies that sustain it. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Antwerp was still handling thousands of tons of cargo each week. The same harbour that had been silent in September now symbolized movement, coordination, and survival. For the soldiers who had fought their way through the Scheldt, it was a victory without fanfare, overshadowed by larger headlines, but one that made every other victory possible. Years later, veterans would recall the campaign not with triumph, but with quiet pride. They remembered the sound of rain on steel helmets, the stench of flooded dikes, and the strange stillness that followed when the last guns fell silent. They had not fought for glory, but for a passage, a corridor of water that turned a city's port into the lifeline of an entire continent. In the end, the Battle of the Scheldt was more than a fight for a river's mouth. It was the story of how the tide of war, both literal and strategic, was turned by those willing to fight through mud and flood for something as abstract as access, the ability to keep an army moving, to keep freedom supplied. And so, when the first great convoys rolled east in early 1945, Their fuel, ammunition, and rations bound for the Rhine and beyond, they carried with them the legacy of that quiet, brutal victory in the lowlands. The Scheldt was open, Antwerp was alive, and through its channels flowed not just the cargo of war, but the momentum that would carry the Allies to final victory in Europe.